Hello, so this is episode 5 of my narrative history of the period 1625 to 1701. And this video is going to cover the years 1660 to 1678. I was originally going to do the whole reign of Charles II in one episode, 1660 to 1685, but there's so much to cover. And I think 1678 is a good place to end this one and start the next one, which will be 1678 to 88. And I think that'll become clear when we get there. So where are we in 1660 to start this one? So we've had the period of the Republic and the various attempts at, experiments in government, which ultimately end with Monk marching from Scotland, restoring the Long Parliament, who dissolved themselves. There's a convention parliament, and they are presented with the Declaration of Breda, which is this kind of healing and settling document from Charles II, where he's basically saying, I'm not going to kind of come in and change everything. I want to kind of, have an amnesty and religious toleration, agree to work with Parliament, all those things. So on the 25th of May, 1660, Charles II lands in Dover. So he returns. So this is the restoration, and the first thing is that the laws that were passed in the period of the Republic are revoked. So things like the Marriage Act, the Adultery Act, the Navigation Act, these acts that were passed by the Rump and the different types of parliaments that were in place in the Republic are revoked. So it's like it never happened. Charles II's reign also is said to start from 1649. So it's almost like that period is kind of erased. In 1660, Parliament passes the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, which again, this is about kind of healing and settling the nation. And this says that only regicides, so those people who are involved in the trial and execution of Charles I, and 9 other individuals are exempt from pardon. So basically, if you're involved in the running of the country during the Republic, you've got nothing to worry about as long as you weren't kind of somebody, who signed the death warrant, something like that. Similarly, another attempt at a kind of new settlement is the Worcester House Declaration, which is an attempted religious settlement between Episcopalians and Presbyterians, so kind of both wings of the church, if you like, try and come together and reach a kind of an agreement, a new church settlement, this idea of like a kind of broad church settlement. Also in 1660, the Convention Parliament is dissolved. So to begin with, 1660, things are, and I think this whole episode largely, or at least the first part of it, is about the kind of new settlement, setting up, the government again, the religious settlement, the power balance between the monarch and Parliament, reasserting those things that have really been done away with in the Republic. So then we get into 1661. Now, things have started off quite well. This is when things change a little bit, and a really, really important moment is at the start of 1661 with Thomas Venner's Fifth Monarchist uprising, and Pepys talks about this in his diary, where people are out on the street with weapons, and he calls them kind of the fanatics are on the way. And this is Venner's Fifth Monarchist uprising, and as we mentioned in the episode on the Republic, because of the kind of toleration of the Republic and the lack of censorship, there's great kind of explosion of dissent, and the Fifth Monarchists are one of those groups, and they believe the end of the world is coming, and they want to kind of take over the government in 1661. This, of course, fails, but this leads to a really significant kind of backlash that we'll talk about. So one example of this backlash is in 1661, you've got the Savoy House Conference, which again is this kind of attempt at kind of a religious settlement, and it fails. So because of divisions between the different groups, between Episcopalians, people who like kind of hierarchy and bishops, and Presbyterians who don't, they can't find a settlement. And also because of Venner's uprising, there's a bit of a backlash. People, particularly kind of high Anglicans, people who don't like Protestant dissent, don't really want to concede much ground. Another example of this backlash is the election of the Cavalier Parliament. So 1661, you've got Venner's uprising, which leads to the election of the Cavalier Parliament. They're very, very pro-royalist, pro-Anglican, anti-tolerant, and it's a backlash to Venner's uprising, and almost like a backlash to the toleration and explosion of dissent of the Republic. Parliament also passes the Militia Act in 1661, which gives, so the Cavalier Parliament, as I said, they're very pro-royalist, and the Militia Act hands back control of the military to the king. So it's a complete shift from what was going on, for example, with the Long Parliament. And then we have the first act of the Clarendon Code. The Clarendon Code, a series of piece of legislation to crush dissent, to narrow the church, and to get rid of kind of Puritan influence in the church. So the first one is the Corporation Act, which says that only Anglicans basically can hold public office. That's the first act. We'll come to the other acts in later years. Also, there's a financial settlement that's kind of agreed. So Parliament agrees to set out regular fixed income for the monarch, 1.2 million a year from customs, duties and excise. There's also a hearth tax that's introduced. However, it really isn't enough. So Parliament really still holds the power over the monarch. It's an improvement on what was going on between the monarch and Charles I in Parliament, but Parliament still really holds the significant power here. It's not quite enough. So then we go on to 1662. Charles II marries Catherine of Braganza, who's Portuguese Catholic princess. Charles, increasingly throughout his reign, is seen as a kind of Catholic sympathizer, and similar to his father, married Henrietta Maria. He marries a foreign Catholic princess, which some people in England are not particularly happy about. In 1662, also the Licensing Act is reintroduced, which leads to censorship of the press. And in 1662, we also get probably the most significant act of the Clarendon Code, which is the Act of Uniformity, which sets out kind of strict definitions of worship in the church. This leads to 1,800 Puritan ministers being ejected from the church. So this is the second piece of legislation, part of the Clarendon Code, the Act of Uniformity, and it really, really narrows the church. It's a return really to the kind of Laudian, high Anglican church. So it's not really a broad church settlement. It's quite narrow here. In 1662, we also get an act to do with religion, which is the Quaker Act. And this leads to severe penalties for Quakers. And an example of this, you could say, is George Fox, the leader of the Quakers. Because of the Quaker Act, he's imprisoned between 1664 and 1666. Charles II, unlike his Parliament, who are very, very anti-tolerant, Charles II is tolerant because his mother is Catholic, his wife is Catholic. Some people say he's kind of secretly Catholic, and he kind of towards the end of his life. Well, we'll talk more about that in the next episode. Anyway, he's pro-toleration, so he issues a declaration of indulgence, which suspends the Act of Uniformity. So this is the monarch going above Parliament, disagreeing with Parliament, and just issuing a declaration of indulgence. It doesn't go through Parliament. He just issues this thing, which suspends the Act of Uniformity. It's directly kind of contradicting what Parliament want. And Parliament forced Charles to withdraw this in 1663 because, as I said before, they hold the financial kind of levers of power. So they don't let him continue with this after 1663. So what we're seeing here is the first sign of kind of conflict between the monarch and Parliament in this restoration period, and it's to do with religion. And this continues throughout this period. However, what I would say is in the 1660s, it's largely about dissent and nonconformity and toleration. In the 1670s and 80s, really it's about Catholicism and fear of Catholicism. Okay, on to 1664. Parliament they repeal the Triennial Act of 1641 and pass a weakened version. Okay, so again, this is handing more power to the monarch. So this and down the line, when we get to the reign of William and Mary, we will see that another Triennial Act is passed. But what the Triennial Act here is it's watered down, and this basically allows for the monarch to dissolve Parliament. 1664, the Conventicle Act is passed, another act as part of the Clarendon Code, which puts limits on dissenting worship. And Charles II also sells Dunkirk to Louis XIV to raise money. And this is the last kind of continental land that England owns. It's gone. 1665, we've got the outbreak of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. This goes on until 1667, and basically it's disastrous for the king. It costs lots of money. The Dutch win. This is where they sail down the Thames and take Charles's ship. It's disastrous. It costs lots of money. Not successful. Also, we have the outbreak of the plague in London. And we also have the 5 Mile Act, which is the last of the 4 acts part of the Clarendon Code. So we've had the Corporation Act, the Act of Uniformity, the Conventicle Act, and now the 5 Mile Act. And 5 Mile Act is about dissenting preachers are forced 5 miles out of towns. Now the Clarendon Code is a failure, really, and one of the reasons is because of things like the 5 Mile Act. By pushing dissenting underground, by pushing them out of towns, it's harder to keep tabs on them. Also, because of the explosion of dissent during the Republic, justices of the peace, local magistrates, people aren't really interested in persecuting dissent. Their neighbours might be dissenters, and it isn't really hugely supported. So the Clarendon Code is a failure. Also, just last point on this, by narrowing the church so much, it creates more dissent. So it's like if you think about prohibition in America, it created more people broke the law. It doesn't actually fix the root cause. So the Clarendon Code's a failure. And when we get to, again, the reign of William and Mary, we see there's another Toleration Act passed because it's at the point where there kind of just has to be. Dissent is kind of accepted at that point. Anyway, 1666, the Great Fire of London. And this is important politically because it's blamed, some people blame it on the kind of sinning monarch that Charles is seen, he has multiple affairs. He's seen as quite, kind of sinful. Also, it's blamed on Catholics. So we're starting to get increasing kind of anti-Catholic feeling. 1667, the Second Anglo-Dutch War ends, which leads to Clarendon's resignation. And Clarendon is Charles II's chief minister, and he's replaced by the Cabal ministry, which includes some Catholics, so not entirely popular. In 1668, James, who's next in line to the throne at this point, Charles's brother, who's the Duke of York, he announces his conversion to Catholicism. So this is where we start seeing increasing kind of fear of Catholicism. Next, we move on to 1670. And Charles II signs a secret Treaty of Dover with Louis XIV. So Charles agrees to back Louis's foreign policy for money. And included in that is a secret clause, which Charles says at a later date he will publicly convert to Catholicism. This is impactful later when we get the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1672, which is a clear example of Charles II supporting Louis's foreign policy, which is not popular in England because people are questioning why is it that England's going to war against the fellow Protestants, the Dutch, and supporting the Catholic French. Anyway, 1672, Charles II is running out of money. He's unable to pay his debts, so he suspends repayments to his creditors, and this is called the stop of the exchequer. So he basically doesn't pay off his debts, and this really impacts confidence in banking. And it's not really until the 1690s and onwards that confidence returns in banking. In 1672, Charles also issues the second Declaration of Indulgence, which is withdrawn in 1673 due to that Third Anglo-Dutch War, which breaks out in 1672. In 1674, we have the end of the Anglo-Dutch War. So again, just to reiterate, that this is very, very unpopular, and it costs lots of money. And the public aren't on board with this. In 1673, we also have the Test Act, which again, similar to the Corporation Act, limits Catholics from holding public office. Most significantly, this means that James, the Duke of York, has to resign from the Navy. So you can see there's a backlash here from Parliament, kind of anti-Catholic backlash. Next, we jump ahead to 1677. Princess Mary, who's James's daughter, marries William of Orange. So this is like an alliance between kind of England and the Dutch, and Mary is kind of the second in line to the throne, third in line at this point, sorry. So James and then Mary, and this is seen as a kind of good move. People are happy about this in England because obviously William of Orange is Protestant. We'll come back to that obviously in future. So that's where we're going to leave this one because, as I said, 1678 is a significant kind of turning point. So what we've had is this healing and settling, this new settlement, political settlement, economic settlement, religious settlement, and as hopefully you've picked up, as time goes on, as we get into 1670s, increasing kind of anti-Catholicism, particularly from Parliament. We've had, the Test Act. We've had kind of outcry at the Third Anglo-Dutch War and outcry at James, the Duke of York, converting to Catholicism publicly. Okay, thank you for listening.